Every history class gives you the same story. The Pope decided to launch a holy war. Knights put on crosses, and Christian Europe marched east to kill people who hadn't done anything to them. The Pope is the villain. That's the version that stuck. But the order didn't come from Rome. It came from Constantinople, from a desperate emperor who was watching his empire get carved apart, writing to the West because he had no other options left. What Urban II did with that letter is a different story entirely, and it changes everything about how you understand the Crusades. To understand why that letter got written, you need to know what the East looked like in the decades before 1095. The Seljuk Turks had been pushing into Anatolia since the 1050s. This wasn't a border dispute or a slow territorial shift. It was systematic destruction of a civilization that had been Christian for 7 centuries. Matthew of Edessa, an Armenian chronicler writing close to these events, records tens of thousands massacred and even more enslaved. Churches weren't caught in the crossfire. They were the target. The destruction was deliberate, and the sources make that plain. Ani was the Armenian capital at the time. People called it the City of 1,001 Churches. When the Seljuks took it, they burned them. All of them. Then they cut down a large crucifix and sent it to Baghdad as a war trophy. That's not conquest. That's a message. Pilgrims were getting the same treatment on the roads to Jerusalem. In 1064 or 1065, a large group of German pilgrims was attacked on the route to the Holy Land. The accounts are brutal. One eyewitness describes a nun gang raped to death in front of the survivors, and then notes that the Turks did this to pilgrims often. Not once. Often. The pilgrimage routes had become killing grounds, and word was getting back to the West. Go back even further, and it gets worse. In 1990, the Fatimid Caliph Al-Hakim ordered the destruction of the Holy Sepulchre, the church built over the site where Christians believed Christ was buried and resurrected. Constantine had built that complex. Al-Hakim leveled it. According to Al-Makrizi, an Egyptian Muslim historian with no reason to inflate Christian losses, Al-Hakim also destroyed 30,000 other churches across Egypt and Greater Syria. That number tells you how heavily Christian that region still was 4 centuries after the Islamic conquest. Most Western historians today quietly drop that figure to 300 or 3,000 and call it a scribal error. They do this without justification. Al-Makrizi wasn't boasting on behalf of defeated Christians. He was recording what his own side did. This is the world Alexios I Komnenos inherited when he took the Byzantine throne. A century of this. Shrinking borders, massacred populations, destroyed holy sites, and pilgrims dying on the roads. By 1095, the Turks were less than 100 miles from Constantinople itself. In March 1095, Byzantine envoys arrived at the Council of Piacenza in northern Italy. They stood before Pope Urban II and asked for help. No transcript of that meeting survives. The original request is gone. What remains are later Latin reconstructions, and scholars have noted that some of these versions were likely shaped by crusading propaganda written after the fact. So we can't quote Alexios word for word. What we can do is reconstruct what he almost certainly wanted, based on the strategic situation he was in. Alexios needed soldiers, trained ones, disciplined ones, professional military contingents he could deploy under Byzantine command to push the Turks back out of Anatolia. He wanted territory restored, frontiers stabilized, and imperial control reestablished in the East. He was not asking for a mass religious movement. He was not asking for a pan-European holy war. He wanted mercenaries he could point at a problem and control. Urban saw something else entirely in that appeal. The papacy in 1095 was in the middle of a power struggle with the German emperor over who held ultimate authority in Christendom. Urban had political rivals. He had an anti-pope, a successful holy enterprise led by Rome aimed at rescuing Eastern Christians and liberating Jerusalem. That would settle a lot of questions about who was really in charge. So at Clermont, 8 months after Piacenza, Urban preached. He described the atrocities in the East. He described what had happened to pilgrims, to churches, to Christian communities. None of that was invented. The suffering was real and documented. But then he reframed the objective entirely. Alexios had asked for help securing Anatolia. Urban called for the liberation of Jerusalem, a city Alexios hadn't named as the primary goal. The engine that made it work was the indulgence. Urban offered full remission of sin to anyone who went, framed as an armed pilgrimage, a sacred journey, and a military campaign fused into one. Nothing like this had ever been offered before. The theological implications were enormous. Violence, under papal authorization and for the right cause, could cleanse a soul. The response at Clermont was immediate and, by every account, uncontrollable. Peasants went, women went, children went, knights went. Hundreds of thousands of people took the cross because the reports coming out of the East had been accumulating for decades, and Urban had just given them something to do about it. Alexios had asked for a controlled contingent. What showed up at his gates was a movement he never ordered and couldn't manage. So here's the version most people learned. Pope Urban II decided to launch a holy war, and Christian Europe, driven by greed, bigotry, and papal manipulation, invented a grievance and marched east to inflict it on people who'd done nothing wrong. The Pope is the aggressor. The Crusaders are the villains. That's the frame. The primary sources don't support it. What the sources show is a civilization that had spent 40 years being dismantled, its cities burned, its pilgrims killed, its holiest sites leveled, finally sending a distress call to the only power in the West, with the authority to answer it. The West responded. The response was transformed by Urban into something bigger than Alexios intended, yes. But Urban didn't manufacture a crisis to justify a war. He repackaged a real one. That's a meaningful distinction, and the textbook version collapses it entirely. The enthusiasm at Clermont wasn't manufactured either. Historians sometimes treat mass popular participation in the crusade as evidence of manipulation, proof that Urban whipped up a frenzy. But you can't manufacture that kind of response from nothing. Women and children don't walk away from their homes toward a war zone because a pope gave a good speech. They do it because the reports reaching them over decades were credible, specific, and terrible. The movement was real because the underlying cause was real. And yet, modern Western historiography has spent considerable effort softening the record that caused it. Al-Makrizi's 30,000 churches becomes a scribal error. The pilgrimage attacks become isolated incidents. Matthew, Edessa's accounts get qualified into near irrelevance. The pattern gets broken into individual data points, so it stops looking like a pattern. Once you do that, the crusade really does look like it came from nowhere, like an act of unprovoked aggression by people with no legitimate reason to move. That framing isn't neutral. It's a choice about which sources to trust and which to discount, and it consistently runs in one direction. The people who actually went on the First Crusade told you what they thought they were doing. They quoted John 15:13. "No greater love has a man than to lay down his life for his friends." They understood the expedition as rescue. Not every crusader was motivated purely by that, and the movement wasn't clean or without atrocity on its own side. But the core motivation recorded in the sources is protection of fellow Christians who were being killed, not conquest of people who were living peacefully. The lie isn't that the Crusades were perfect. The lie is more specific than that. It's that they came from nowhere, that the Pope invented them for power, and that the people who went had no legitimate grievance to respond to. None of those things hold up against the record. A Byzantine emperor started the chain. Urban transformed it into something larger. The people who responded were reacting to something documented and real. That's the history. The textbook buried the emperor and started the story with the Pope. When you erase Alexios, you erase the century of destruction that made his letter necessary. And that erasure is what lets the Pope as villain narrative survive. If this kind of history matters to you, subscribe. There's more of it coming, and most of it doesn't look like what you were taught.